Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third module in our technology toolkit. I hope everyone is managing to enjoy some of this sunshine rather than just swelter in your office. I'm Jonathan Turner and I lead technology strategy and innovation here at Fair for All Finance. And today we are delighted to be joined by the National Cybersecurity Centre, NCSC, which is part of GCHQ. You have to learn to live with acronyms when you work in tech, but we love them. And the guests from the NCSC are going to take us through the core content of this module. And this is actually part B of the third module, because last week we ran a session for your board members on cybersecurity and introduced the NCSC's, that's a very hard thing to say, the NCSC's excellent board toolkit. But before we start, I'd like to set this module in the context of a series of modules that we've been launching over the past 6 months. On the run up to Christmas, many of you will have been involved in, and thank you for your participation in the survey across community finance organisations to help us better understand how technology is being used by the sector. And there were 3 key findings in that survey that have really directed the work that we've been doing at Fair for All, and they've been the basis and the foundation for the technology toolkit. And the 3 findings were, first one, that a large part of the community finance sector is dependent on legacy technologies, which in itself isn't an issue. But we did get feedback from users that a lot of the software that's being supplied by suppliers hasn't been keeping up with technology innovations and evolutions and using technology standards, which has raised or raises a red flag for cybersecurity. And we'll hear a bit more about that in a minute. The second observation or finding from the survey was that organizations spend a relatively small amount on their technology. 50% of those that we surveyed spend less than £50,000 per annum, which for a financial services organisation, and in most cases becoming more digital and engaging with their consumers through mobile or the web, is a pretty low number. I'm not saying that that's not impossible to work on 50,000, but it certainly presents some major challenges in running a stable, safe, secure platform on that kind of budget. And the third finding was that IT capability within the organisations in the sector is low. And that's no criticism of the organisations, it's simply a fact that lenders are typically small organisations with very few people in the team. Over 50% of those that we surveyed reported not having a technologist on their team at all. So in order to help address the capability challenge at a low cost to the industry, we've set about launching the technology toolkit. And to date, we've run a session called Technology 101, which was intended to bring everyone up to a level of understanding and appreciation of technology in the context of community finance. And the second module we delivered on digital strategies and why you need one. And that was accompanied by an ebook to help organisations to develop their strategies. And then this one is the third, which we feel really important to bring up front as one of the earlier modules. There's been and continues to be much publicised cybersecurity or cyber attacks around the world. Only yesterday we saw in the headlines that Chinese state actors were being accused of their involvement in the Microsoft Exchange server attacks back in January this year, which impacted over 30,000 businesses worldwide. And then there was WannaCry in 2017 and the Colonial Pipeline attack in the US earlier this year. And the more we look and talk with community finance providers, the more we learn that you too have been and continue to be targeted by cyber criminals. And in some cases, you have been victims of successful attacks. As an FS organisation, a financial services organisation, you're in the spotlight of cyber criminals, and you may well be seen as softer targets than mainstream finance, who typically spend millions on their cybersecurity. So this module is intended for the executive teams, operations leads, IT leads within your organizations to introduce some of the threats that you might face as SMEs and how you can use some of the resources available from the NCSC to address these threats, and to communicate with you, how to communicate with your board about how you're handling cybersecurity as an organization. So today, Victoria will introduce the NCSC and some of the free tools that they've made available to you. Chris will take us through the threat landscape for SMEs, and Hannah will introduce the board toolkit and how that is relevant to you in your role in your organizations. So that's it from me. There's going to be a Q&A at the end of the session, so please do post any questions that you have in the Q&A function. Your questions will be seen by other participants on this call, so please make sure you don't include any sensitive information or things you wouldn't normally share more widely. And the session's being recorded and we'll make it available to you after this call and to your peers. But now it's over to Victoria.
Perfect. Thank you, Jonathan. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having us here today. My name is Victoria and I lead on small and medium-sized business engagement for the NCSC, and I'm here today with my colleagues Hannah and Chris, also in the Economy and Society team. I thought I'd start today just by explaining a little bit about what we do and who the NCSC are, and then I'll touch on a bit about the products and guidance and free tools that we have available that you can access on our website. So if we could just move to the next one, please. So the NCSC was set up in October 2016 in support of our national ambition, which is to make the UK the safest place to live and do business online. Sorry, it's just one slide back. And the UK needed a coherent legal authority that could bring together all those previously separate parts of government that were leading on cybersecurity and bring it all together to be the NCSC's one-stop shop. So there's a few things that we do. One of the first things that we do is looking to help understand cybersecurity. And distill that knowledge into practical guidance. So understanding how we protect those things we care about the most. The second strand is our reduce strand, which is where we sit in the Economy and Society team. And this is helping reduce the risk to the UK by working with public and private sector organisations to help improve their cybersecurity. So that means improving the cybersecurity health of organisations, making the internet easier to use safely, and making the internet automatically safer to use. So the next one, which is really the bread and butter of the NCSC, is respond. So responding to cybersecurity incidents to reduce the harm that they cause to the UK. So when a cybersecurity incident does happen, we are there to help the victim and help manage that cyber incident and get them back up and running again across lots of other organisations to help pull that together and coordinate that response. And finally, we also look to nurture. So nurture and grow our national cybersecurity capability. So things such as our Cyber First campaign, where we nurture young talent by developing the UK's next generation of cyber professionals. So this could be through student bursaries and competitions that we run. The next one, please. So if I was to point you to anything on our website that would really help you understand the types of activities that we undertake and the things that we do, and for you to get a snapshot really of what we've done over the last 12 to 18 months, I'd point you to the annual review on our website. So this covers from September 2019 to August 2020. And throughout this, it really pinpoints quite a number of different things. So the NCSC handled 723 incidents during this time, with around 200 of those relating to coronavirus specifically. And what we've seen is cyber criminals were really looking to exploit public fear over the pandemic with coronavirus related online scams. So one of the things that we launched last year to help this with the City of London Police was our suspicious email reporting service. And we've already received millions and millions of reports from the public and from businesses, which is resulted in thousands of malicious websites being taken down. So we've got an email address for this service where you can forward phishing emails. And what we'll do with these emails, we'll analyze the suspect email and any websites that are linked to it. And we'll use any additional information you've provided to actually look for and monitor any suspicious activity. So if we do discover activity that we believe to be malicious, we'll seek to block the address the email came from so it can no longer send emails. And we'll also work with hosting companies to remove links to malicious websites. And then what we'll do is we'll raise awareness of any commonly reported suspicious emails and any methods used via our partners through law enforcement, action fraud, and any amplification partners that we've got. We can't actually inform you of the outcome because we received too many of the reports, but we can confirm that we do act upon every email that we receive from you. The other thing that's in the review is a lot about ransomware. So the growing threat from ransomware is really starkly revealed in this review. It discloses that we handled more than 3 times as many ransomware incidents compared to the year before. And alongside the rise in ransomware incidents, we've also seen there's been a marked shift in the way criminals actually carry out these attacks. So obviously, traditionally, victims are denied access to their own data until the ransom is paid. However, attackers are increasingly threatening to leak sensitive information publicly until that payment is received. So what we've done in response to this is we've updated our ransomware guidance on our website to reflect the changing nature of it. And it also emphasises our commitment to ensuring that we help organisations and businesses who come into contact with ransomware and support law enforcement. I won't mention any more on ransomware. I think that's about it really on that slide, but I would really encourage you to go and take a look at the annual review and have a look at the more wider activities that we've done for specific sectors. And there's a lot on there about the finance sector as well and what we've done to support them. So if we could move on to the next one, please. I thought I'd just touch really briefly on our team. So we look after 5 communities in the Economy and Society team. So UK business engagement, so these are large private sector businesses. We look after SMEs, which I said I've already mentioned that Chris and I work on. We cover education and academia, charity in the voluntary sector, and also the public sector as well. And our role really is to raise the resilience and maturity of these priority sectors. And in terms of our common approach really across these sectors, we look at simplification. So how can we make cybersecurity guidance easy and accessible? We look at knowledge sharing. So we use NCSC Insight to help others and increase people's awareness of the cyber threat. And we also build partnerships with amplification partners, industry, in order to improve our understanding of the challenges that each sector is facing so that we can shape our offer to make sure that we're pushing out the right advice and guidance to those organisations. That was right. Yep, I'll move on to the next one now. So in terms of the products and services that we have available, you'll find lots of practical advice and guidance on our website. You'll also find advice on mitigations for current threats. You'll find threat reporting, so we push out a weekly summary. You'll find an inquiries area where you can get in touch with any questions you may have. And you also find links to key products and services. So a few of these are up on the screen here. So just to pick out a few of them. Our cybersecurity information sharing partnership platform, which is quite difficult to say, that's CISP. So this is a safe environment that provides an opportunity for a community of people, mainly IT professionals, to engage, share and collaborate on cybersecurity matters. So I'd encourage you to sign up to CISP. You'll find instructions on how to do so on our website, and then you can either join a specific sector node or you can join your regional node and start looking at intelligence sharing and information that we post on there that will be useful to you and your organisation. Another one I want to mention on there is Top Tips for Staff, our e-learning package. So this is something you can either run directly from our website and push out to members of staff, or you can build it into your own, say, content management system or whatever program you have to push out e-learning to staff. So this covers things such as passwords, phishing, and it's really there to help raise the bar for staff members who have access to IT, help them understand their responsibility. And it's really talking about how you can help create a positive cybersecurity culture within your organisation. It's about rewarding staff and not punishing them if they receive a phishing email and they accidentally click on the link. And how you can really kind of push cybersecurity out to staff at that really fundamental, actionable kind of level that's not too complicated, but it helps staff understand their responsibility and what they need to do, regardless of their roles. So really at that basic level, an introductory to cybersecurity. So you can find that on our website, completely free for you to use and push out to your staff. Another thing I want to mention on there is Exercise in a Box. So this was launched at Cyber UK, our flagship event a couple of years ago. And this is again a free online tool which has been produced and created by us, which helps organisations test and practice your response to a cyber attack. So an introduction to exercising. You don't have to be an expert to use it. It's got lots of tabletop exercises that we built in there based on a number of different scenarios that you can go ahead and start using within your organisation. So you can sign up completely for free. It's a global tool, so if you've got offices in other countries, they can use it as well. And it will help run through some tabletop exercises to see how you would respond in those different scenarios. And there's also a simulation exercise, which is a bit of a find the flag exercise, which is a bit more technical that you can do once you've completed the tabletop exercises. And finally, before I pass over to Chris, I wanted to touch on penetration testing, because it's something that Jonathan mentioned that you're interested in. So the caveat to this is that I'm not very technical. So I'm really in this slide pointing you to our website, to some really good guidance that a lot of technical people in the NCSC have produced for you. So the guidance you'll find on our website on penetration testing will help you understand the proper commissioning and use of penetration tests, and it will help you plan your routine security measures so you can gain maximum benefit from pen testing. So a couple of things that I will point out about it before I pass on is that pen testing should be viewed as a method for gaining assurance in your organisation on any vulnerability assessments and management processes that you already have in place and that you're already doing, not as a primary method for identifying vulnerabilities. And a penetration test should be thought of as something similar, I suppose, to a financial audit. So your finance team track expenditure and income day to day. An audit by an external group ensures that your internal team processes are sufficient. So it's not instead of, it's in an ideal world, I suppose, you should know what the penetration testers are going to find before they actually find it. And then I suppose a highly experienced pen tester may be able to find any subtle issues which your internal processes may not have picked up on. So it should be kind of like that extra service that you bring in that could help maybe get some board buy-in, that you can say, look, this external company's come in and they're verifying what we need to improve and what we need to do to bring that bar up for our cyber security that you may not have been able to sell to the board on your own. So by bringing someone external, it can kind of get that official report that you can take to the board and say, this is what we should be doing, this is how much money I need you to allocate me to be able to do it. In terms of actual pen testers, for public sector organisations, we've got a check scheme where NCSC has got a list of approved companies. But for private sector organisations, so non-government organisations, we say you should use pen testers that are qualified under one of the following certification schemes. So CREST, Tiger Scheme or Cyber Scheme. And again, you'll find more information on our website of who we recommend that you should go to for pen testing. And I think, like it says up on the screen there, you should ensure that the external team that you're using, the pen testers, have the relevant qualification and skills to perform the testing that you need that is relevant for your IT estate, especially if there's any niche or specific things that you might need testing with a niche to your network itself. So yeah, please do look at our website for more information on the guidance we have on pen testing. It's really comprehensive and it will really help get you started and help you decide who to go to and what to expect. So now I'll pass you on to Chris, who will talk to you a bit about the threat landscape.
Thank you, Vic, and good afternoon to everybody for joining us today. My name is Chris. I'm the SME Engagement Officer within the team, and I just want to spend the next 10 minutes outlining the breaches and the impacts we've seen, especially over the last year as well, as we've moved greater to remote hybrid working and some of the impacts we've been facing. Can I just get a confirmation we can see the slides on the screen? Excellent. The best place to look at the trends we're seeing in the cybersecurity landscape year on year is the Cyber Breaches Survey, which is published by the Department for Culture, Media and Support. As it says there, this is a quantitative and qualitative survey which identifies the risk we're seeing and the attitudes and awareness across a series of UK businesses and charities, and this then helps us to track those trends and being able to respond appropriately, identifying where we may need greater intervention to help UK businesses and charities with their cybersecurity. And it shouldn't come no surprise to those on the call this afternoon that the digital footprint of organisations is growing year on year. 82% of businesses all now have online bank accounts, with nearly 3 in 5 having social media pages or accounts. And new for this year is we've looked at how many organisations now have network connected devices, how many organisations are using IoT as part of their business operations, and as we can see, that's closing in as half of all businesses surveyed have some form of network connecting devices. And this is a huge problem. This creates greater vulnerabilities, greater weaknesses within our network, within our infrastructure, and a greater need to make sure that we're patching it and updating these various areas and make sure that we're applying strong practices and good security controls. The positive is that many businesses understand the perceived importance of cybersecurity, that they are aware of the need for good cybersecurity, good security controls, and having the correct IT in place. As we see, nearly 77% of all businesses rated their priority as either very high or fairly high, which is a great indication that this is something that is very much high on an organisation's agenda and understanding the perceived risk a cyber attack can have to your organisation. And with that comes the board responsibility. Make sure that the exec board and our C-suite have the correct awareness and correct information when it comes to our cybersecurity posture and the risk of a cyber attack to our businesses. Businesses overall responded that at least they have one board member who is updated on a regular basis, and obviously depending on the organisation's sector, especially around finance and communications and professional technical sectors, this then grows for up to 55%. Now, Hannah will talk about the importance of having boards aware of the risk of cybersecurity and cyber attacks. And it's important that we're having that buy-in from our C-suite and they are kept up to date as to what is happening to our cybersecurity posture. And the inverse of this is that whilst we are seeing 4 in 10 organisations responding that they have a level of board responsibility, the inverse of that is that near enough 60% of organisations don't have that board responsibility in place. So it's really important we have that buy-in from our board and C-suite. And over the last year as well, we've seen 4 in 10 businesses report having a cybersecurity breach of any kind, whether that's a loss of data or otherwise. And the frequency of these attacks is growing. Near enough half of all UK businesses who responded in the cybersecurity breach survey reported that they are suffering a breach or attack more than once a month, which is absolutely huge. And obviously for our micro businesses and sole traders, this frequency does and can increase. So it's important that when we're looking at how the breaches are impacting UK organisations, UK businesses, we factor in the frequency of these attacks as well, because where we're seeing more than once a month or more, this is a huge problem, and the real need there to intervene and make sure that we have the correct processes, we have the correct controls in place to be able to effectively respond and recover from the frequency of these attacks. And it should come as no surprise to many on the call that the main cause of a cyber breach over the last 12 months was phishing attacks or colleagues opening malicious attachments or clicking on malicious links. And then this obviously pivots into great attacks, great access into our networks. As Vic mentioned, ransomware has become a huge threat to UK cyberspace in the last 12 months. So it's important that not only do we have the correct technology in place, we have a level of awareness training when it comes to our end users, making sure that we have staff who are confident in spotting a malicious email or suspicious activity and feeling comfortable to report that, whether it's to our IT department, our managers, but making sure they have a method of reporting malicious activity in the network. Too often at times, staff don't feel empowered to call this activity out. They don't know what to do, and this is when mistakes start to creep in, and we have users clicking on links when we potentially, just by a bit of training, we can prevent them from clicking on malicious attachments. And the impacts we've seen in the last 12 months are, obvious to us all. It is the temporary loss of access to files or networks. It's the loss of our websites, our services, whether they're taken down or made slower. And we're potentially looking at that money stolen and damage to physical devices or equipment, all of which have a financial cost to them. There's a huge financial impact here, which can be very difficult for organisations to recover from, especially when we look at our micro businesses who simply do not have the revenue to be able to respond to a cyber attack and then put in the preventative measures to prevent further attacks. Is a huge sum of money. And it's as we've seen there, of those businesses who suffered a cyber breach, there's a need for new measures to put in place, additional staff time to deal with the breach, and again, there's a cost of staff not being able to carry out their daily operations. That lost time and money in staff not being able to carry out their daily operations, which is why the cost of a cyber breach on average has gone up. The average cost was just shy of £8,500 this year. Last year it was in the region of £3,500, so just in the space of 12 months we've seen a £5,000 on average increase. And a fantastic report by Ipsos Mori really broke this down into 4 quadrants. It's the short-term and direct costs, which we're all familiar with, the cyber ransom, the financial theft, and the staff response time, whether that's external staff or paying our IT practitioners overtime. But also the long-term indirect costs, which were very difficult to put a financial value on, the reputation damage, the supply chain attrition, and the loss of new existing customers. And when we think about some of the major cyber breaches we've seen in the last 24 to 36 months, these companies now are still struggle to rebuild that reputational the reputational damage done to the organisation and build back that customer confidence. So the the impact of a cyber breach simply are not just those short-term direct costs that we're seeing. It really is the long-term indirect cost, which can last weeks, months, years, and potentially not recover from. Which is why I think it's so important that as IT practitioners, we have that buy-in from our seniors, from the C-suite, from our executives, and making sure that they are aware of our security posture and the risk we face to our organisation, and by not having the correct measures in place or not being able to respond effectively and being able to stamp out cyber attacks either at the early stages or even better prevent them from happening in the first place. Which is why I'm now going to pass to Hannah. Hannah's going to talk through the executive board toolkit, which outlines some of the products and guidance we have in place to help build that relationship with the executive board. So over to you, Hannah.
So not Hannah, but just before we move it, sorry, this is not what we arranged, or not what we rehearsed, but I'm just stepping in because there have been a number of new people who have joined the call since my introduction. So I just wanted to make people aware that there is a Q&A function on the screen. Please do ask any questions. We've got some time reserved at the end of this for the NCSC team to respond to those questions. Again, please do be conscious of what you put in there, that it's information that you would be happy to share across the participants. But now I will hand over to Hannah for the final part of the presentation. Hannah, you're on mute.
I am. I'm so sorry. I was also having a bit of a problem with my slides there as well. Can I just get a nod? Have you got the whole of the title slide?
Yes, we have.
Excellent. Right. In that case, I shall continue. Okay. So I'm going to be talking, as you've heard, specifically about the board toolkit, which is a particular product that NCSC has developed. And I'm going to explain what its relevance might be to people like yourself as we go. Now, it's interesting because we have produced the board toolkit to help boards tackle cybersecurity. And one of the things we realised almost straight away was that it was often technologists, CISOs or the equivalent that were really driving it within organisations and championing this toolkit and finding it very useful themselves. Which is great. I mean, it's a very happy sort of way that has worked out. So we know that we really can help organisations as a whole by informing people, technologists within organisations about the toolkit too. So that's what we're going to do today. So I'm going to just run through a few things in a moment about what we've heard from CISOs about their perceptions of working with board members. But then I'm going to quite briefly go through how we usually present and explain things to board members themselves. So what we say about making the case for why cybersecurity is a strategic issue, why it's something that has to be considered at that sort of governance level. And then I will just do a very brief introduction to the toolkit itself, not the content, because it is thousands and thousands of words long. So sort of just introducing you to the structure of it and its role and how it can be used. And then I'll also explain something about the questions within the toolkit, because they're a pretty crucial part of how it's being put together. Then I'll just end by giving some examples of how organisations have used the toolkit so far. And then what I'm going to do at the end is just come back to that sort of list, those reflections of what we hear from CISOs and the like about the struggles they have about communicating effectively with the board and getting that sort of dialogue going, because I think it could be really interesting to share tips amongst ourselves and see how many of the things that we mention actually resonate. So that's the general approach I'm taking. Now, so earlier this year, we got some independent review done of how the toolkit was being used by various private sector organisations. And people were interviewed, and we had both board members and senior technologists interviewed. And it got some really useful and insightful information out of that. And I thought what it might be interesting to do to sort of start this section of the presentation off really is to just reflect back to you what we hear quite frequently from CISOs and people in similar roles about the difficulties they perceive and they experience in their communications with the board and getting the board on board, if you like, with what they need from cybersecurity. Now, obviously, this is not all board members and not all CISOs, and some of these points overlap rather, but I still think they're quite interesting. So first of all, we hear a lot that board members aren't really necessarily quite sure what cybersecurity is, and that they think it's exclusively an IT issue. That's their starting point. We hear a lot people saying that they feel that the board wants to be told what the risks are and want to be told what mitigations are in place, but they basically CISOs are often saying that they feel like they're being pressured to give easier answers than it's possible to give. Related to that, they hear a lot about boards that are really quite focused on metrics and their desire to keep reviewing and keep cybersecurity under control comes down to creating metrics that aren't necessarily fit for purpose, may reduce the complexity of the issue. And often when it comes to discussions about whether to invest in particular solutions, the focus becomes very much on ROI, which of course I think everyone can understand in principle, but obviously that's also a very difficult thing to actually project and make a case for. And then an interesting one we hear quite a lot, especially in smaller organisations and in public and third sector organisations, is that we often hear that the board is not necessarily getting the information they need about cybersecurity from the right people within the organisation. So within universities and colleges, for example, it's quite often the case that the head of information security is actually reporting into perhaps the finance department. And so information around cybersecurity decisions are often coming in through that particular filter. So board members aren't really hearing from the people on the ground, or the people at least directing the people on the ground. And so there's a real sort of lack of information there. That point was so important, I put it in twice. And then finally, I suppose it's related to the very first point about board members sometimes thinking cybersecurity is just exclusively an IT issue, is that in doing that, they're just not seeing cybersecurity as something more broad, and in particular, they're not thinking about processes and they're not thinking about people, and particularly culture. So some of those points may or may not resonate with you. And I suppose the sort of flip side of this is, then what do we hear from board members about where they think things aren't working as well as they could be in their communications with their technical experts? So we're sometimes told, quite frequently told, that their technical experts aren't explaining things clearly enough. They're going perhaps straight into the detail without giving oversight, which means that people are perhaps getting lost quite quickly, or they're losing sense of the bigger picture. Related to that, they have a concern that these discussions very quickly become stuck in the weeds, which I think relates to this other concern or perception that in some cases, the technical experts are too focused on the IT and not the broader business priorities, which is really interesting because, of course, the thing we hear from technical experts is that they're saying that they think the board thinks it's only about IT. So I suppose what this shows us is there's sort of a real communications issue here, and conversations that need opening up, and sort of education, I suppose, in some sense, is on both sides. Although I don't really want to call it sides because that automatically sounds confrontational, which is certainly not what it should be. So that's the background, I suppose, to what you may or may not find pertinent about different people's perspectives on how cybersecurity is working within many organisations. So I'm now going to whip through this bit quite quickly because it's just for your background, really. And sorry, do excuse me, I'm sitting in a very hot room with the window open. There's some skips going past. But this part of the presentation is actually available on our website, and I'll give you the link later. But what I'm going to do now is just sort of skip through fairly quickly the way we go about explaining to board members why cybersecurity is a board level responsibility, because we know that not every board member is aware of that, or if they are, they're not really quite sure why. So we tend to talk about cybersecurity being an enabler and talk about how many core parts of any business are absolutely dependent on digital services, and such that if there is some kind of major cyber incident, can the business actually function, or to what degree can it function? It's often interesting to give a specific example of an organisation in the same sector about how, when they've had some kind of cyber incident, about what parts they have or haven't been able to keep operational, what parts of business, and the impact that's had. So we talk about the fact that nearly all organisations are dependent on digital technology to even function. And then we talk about the cost of remedying cyber incidents in all sorts of ways, whether that's the cost in terms of technical support or lost business or reputation, and the way that these three issues really interact to mean that cybersecurity has to be considered by everybody on a board, because even if they're not considering it as part of the board, as part of business as usual, when there's a major incident, they very quickly realise that it impacts on every aspect of the company's function. We then often talk about these three myths that came up a lot in the research we put in before producing the toolkit. And I think most of us will be able to understand how these myths have arisen, and why they might actually be off-putting to board members. So the idea that cybersecurity is too complex for people to understand, and for that we sort of make the point that the details of cybersecurity may indeed be too complex for many people to understand unless they've got that kind of technical background or grounding. But we're urging board members to learn enough about the basics and the principles to be able to have these conversations they need to have. Now, interestingly, I'll just stay with that point actually, something else that came out of this research earlier in the year was that in boards, particularly very successful and very large companies, you have board members who have been appointed because they are very successful and effective senior leaders. They are people who know how to manage complicated projects and large organisations. They are skilled and very able professionals. They know about risk, they know about finance, but actually cybersecurity is simply something they wouldn't necessarily haven't had to know about in the past. And that can be actually a bit of a cultural block for some board members, because they're used to being the expert and all of a sudden there's something else they're asked to being involved with and being actively involved with, and they haven't got that knowledge that they are used to having before they can become an active active board member in this particular area, and that can be quite a barrier. We also talk about this idea that cyber attacks are so sophisticated, there's nothing that can be done to stop them. Obviously, that's very fatalistic, and we emphasise that really quite simple and often free or very cheap measures can make a real difference to an organisation's risk. And then there's the issue about how targeted cyber attacks are. A lot of people in a lot of organisations have a sense that their data or their industry isn't going to be of enough interest to an attacker. And so talking about untargeted attacks, the risk from them, but also talking particularly this year, I suppose, about ransomware and the fact that any personal data has a value to an attacker, even if it's the amount that an organisation will pay to get that back, I think is really making the point that cybersecurity is relevant to everyone. So we talk about myths and reality. And then it's often quite nice to just talk through this particular breach, I think largely because it was in the news quite a lot of when it happened, 2016, the TalkTalk data breach, and there's some just very nice figures that we can pull out about what the impact of this data breach was. Now, you may or may not remember it, but in short, some attackers got into the database behind TalkTalk's external website, and therefore extracted a lot of personal information about customers and published a lot of it. So there was a really major impact from this. So we have to talk about that. And then what really helps drive the point home is this quote that the Information Commissioner's Office gave when they did the report into this talk breach. Now, it was the largest fine that the ISO had ever levied, but this quote just really helps, I think, hammer the message home. So today's record fine acts as a warning to others that cybersecurity is not an IT issue, it's a boardroom issue. Sorry, that skipped forward. And companies must be diligent and vigilant. They must do this not only because they have a duty under law, but because they have a duty to their customers. And I think you can probably understand that it's this sort of point that really convinces board members that this is something they do have to look at. We've also got a couple of slides here from the survey that Chris mentioned, the cybersecurity breaches survey done by the Department of Culture, Media and Sport. I won't go through these in any detail with you, but just so you know that we talk to board members about these. It gives us statistics on what sort of importance organisations are attaching to cybersecurity. It's actually quite encouraging. Actually, 80% say they overall they give it a high priority. And there are also figures about boards that have a particular board member with a cybersecurity brief. And it's quite interesting to see how that varies over different sectors and indeed over different size organisations. So that's, I suppose, the point at which we have introduced why cybersecurity is a board level issue, why it's strategic, why it's essential. You knew all of that already. So this is what basically we can do to help board members with it. Now, the cybersecurity toolkit for boards was produced, we launched about 2 years ago, and its role is to be guidance to support board members get up to speed with this topic they may or may not be familiar with. So going back to what I was saying about this sort of low starting point for many board members and needing to give them that's an entry level point really. And this board, the toolkit was designed primarily for corporate boards. In fact, a lot of the early research we did was with FTSE 350 companies. But as the toolkit was being developed and tested, it soon became clear that the key messages are pertinent to any board in any sector. So we have school governors using it, for example, and charity trustees. So it can be used by boards of any size, whether it's private or public sector, and in any sector. And then, yes, final point, the guidance is mainly available online. Now, there is a PDF for people like me who need to take in complex information by printing out and using a highlighter. But a lot of the research, the user research, showed that board members were saying they wanted something they could access on the web. So that's the basics of what we've produced. It's about 10,000 words long. It's pretty long because it's a reference library, really, and that's what we want it to be. So in terms of how it can help board members, was this going back to this whole theme about enabling board members to get just a little bit technical. So this whole idea about getting them technical enough so they can get involved in decision making. And as part of that, we are giving examples of the sort of questions that we think board members might want to be asking to really interrogate their organisation's cyber resilience. And part of the point of these questions is it's not just about assurance, but we know that these questions actually then lead to other conversations. It's often the conversations they lead to that end up making the most difference and prompting action. And we're going to come to the questions in just one moment. So the toolkit itself, you may or may not have seen it, but it basically structured. We've got the introduction to cybersecurity, which is very much to give everybody the same starting point. And then we've split it into 9 core modules, and I'll show you what those are in a moment. And for each of the 9 modules, we say why this particular aspect is important and what we think board members should be looking at with it, and then ask the particular questions around it. And then we finish with appendices and reference material, sort of information that's likely to be of much more use to you than it is many of your board members. So that's the way it's structured. And here are the 9 modules. Now, it is modular, by which the important bit of that is that we are not expecting or suggesting that people should work all the way through it from 1 to 9. There is some sort of broadly sequential flow to this, but what we really want organisations to do is to focus on the areas that they know are their priority areas or where they feel they need to address most. So we are quite happy with people jumping around, or indeed jumping straight in at one particular module and not another. So the first three of these we used to call getting the basics right, or getting the foundations right. The point being, they're not specific cybersecurity issues in terms of they're not about risk management, for example, or mitigations, but they're not nice to have. They really are absolutely essential if any company is going to have an effective approach to cybersecurity. So things like growing skills and expertise and developing a positive culture. So those three really are quite crucial. As mentioned a couple of times, each of the 9 modules ends with questions. These are questions for board members. And the idea of the questions is that they are sort of applying the theory, I suppose, they've given some kind of theory in the module, and they're applying this information and showing how you can actually use it. And so what that actually means for what that means to your organisation. How do you find out the relevance of it? So we have a range of questions asked at the end of each module, and I'm very keen to point out that although the questions, they don't often have easy answers. We might give a range of answers that the board member may expect to hear, and sometimes actually the questions are followed by follow-up questions, and that comes back to this whole idea that what we're trying to do is create this environment where board members and technical experts are talking and discussing, and they're in genuine dialogue. Now, in response to feedback from the first iteration of the toolkit, we've made it really clear that the questions are asked of slightly separate audiences. I'm going to show you what I mean in the next slide, but broadly, what we're saying is there are different aspects to what board members need to know and need to be thinking about with cybersecurity. On one level, there are particular questions that they need to be thinking about in terms of themselves and their personal role. So they're questions for themselves almost. And the next level of questions are questions that we are suggesting that the board as a whole needs to be asking. It needs to be discussing amongst itself how it's dealing with particular issues. And those questions often relate to structure or governance. And then that final, those core set of questions at the end, and most questions fall into this group, are the questions that we are suggesting that board members might want to be asking their technical experts to seek assurance on. So this is us being very clear that we are not expecting board members to get into the weeds with these questions and to understand every last detail, but these are exactly the sort of questions that they do need to be asking to get an oversight of how things are actually working within the company. So this sort of puts this into some kind of, well, hopefully it makes it look a little clearer what I'm talking about. At the top, this is a screenshot from a publication we have put together, which is simply the questions and answers from the toolkit, not the main part of the module itself. So as you can see, this is the 9th module, which is also the final module, and this one is about planning a response to cyber incidents. And hopefully you can see that above question 1, that says questions for board members. And that one is, do I understand my role during an incident? And have I had training to equip me? So as I said, that's very much about a personal responsibility as a board member. Question 2 is a question for the board as a whole. Do we know who leads on an incident and who has the authority to take any decisions? So it's about their collective responsibility and their way of working together. And then questions 3 and 4, and actually there's another 2 questions here as well, about questions for the organisations. These are the ones about seeking assurance from people like yourself. So wanting to know perhaps about the incident management plan you might have, or how the organisation knows when an incident has occurred. And there you can see we've given answers, a sort of sample answer, sort of thing board members might hear. So I hope that makes that all a bit more practical in terms of what I was saying about different audiences for the questions. So the toolkit is available online. As I said, we're now creating it as a bit more of a hub, which you don't need to know the details of what that means in terms of NCSE website design, but we're trying to put more resources around the guidance itself. So that's just a screenshot of how it's looking on board at the moment. And you'll see on the top the options. We've got guidance, audio, video and resources, just to show that we've got some backup resources to help. After I go back there. So for example, I mentioned we've now got a few presentations available to download or watch on YouTube, and there's links to those from the resources and the audio and video section. And the other thing we've done first of, but we are looking to do more of, is do some what we're calling spotlight topics. So occasionally to pull out quite particular cybersecurity issues and focus on what board members need to know about that and some specific questions around that. So the first one we've published was around ransomware, because there's plenty within the toolkit about incidents and incident management. Ransomware, as you all know, has its own particular challenges. So we will be producing more of these sorts of spotlight topics. So just going to whiz through this, just give you a few examples how it's been used so far, and then I think it is time to go to questions and comments from you. So how it's being used so far. We know that several boards have looked at two particular modules that they know they are their main area of concern and focused on those in some detail at a board away day with technical people there. Interestingly, this comes back to where I started and saying how much it's often been technical experts have been driving the use of the toolkit. We've actually had quite a lot of CISOs and equivalent look at the toolkit and say to board members or say to somebody senior within the organisation that this is a particular framework for cybersecurity that I think it is useful for the board to be considering, or for us to be focusing our communications on, writing a sort of top level report about how they consider the company is stacking up in those 9 areas, and then that's leading to a much broader conversation about how those communications between the board and technical experts will work moving forward. Then we've had, well, a bit like today, I suppose, we've had many sector-specific governance sessions where there's been a request to look at a particular module or a couple of modules and people pooling their information very much through Chatham House rules. You know, on the basis that anything that the sector can learn, any sector can learn from each other, actually makes the whole sector stronger. And then we've had internal auditors decided to use some of the questions as part of their audits. And then if you've got a board that is much more practical and action oriented, some people have found it more useful to start with a blog we released when the toolkit was first published, which was called 5 Questions for Your Board Agenda. And they were very practical questions like, what are we doing about phishing? How do we manage access control? So these are sort of various access points to it, I suppose. As promised, I will finish in just one moment, but I thought it might just be interesting to refresh you where I started, of what we hear from some board members, about some board members, from IT professionals. And I suppose I'm hoping that we've addressed a lot of these concerns in what we're producing with the toolkit, and also how we're introducing it to board members. But we're certainly always happy to receive feedback and thoughts on that. So at that point, over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much, Hannah. That was fantastic. That's a really comprehensive overview of the toolkit and how it applies not only to the board but to the executive management in the organisations. Now we would go over to Q&A. We don't have any questions from the audience. Please do post them now if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask anyone from the NCSC team or from us. But just, I have a question which really comes from the conversations I've been having with community finance providers. The attack that seems to be most experienced by credit unions, actually, that I've seen, has been ransomware attacks, where customer data or member data has been compromised, and the cyber criminal is then holding the organisation to a ransom. And my question is to you, Hannah, what should you do as an organisation when that comes up, when you are put in that position?
And that you're talking specifically about the vexed issue of whether one should consider paying, I assume.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Happy to take that. So with the caveat that the UK government recognises that this is something for each company or organisation has to decide for itself. There is nothing generally in legislation preventing them from paying a ransom if they choose to, but we would certainly make people aware of a lot of issues they should consider before deciding to do so. So first of all, there's I suppose the ethical or the broader issue about what you will be doing is undoubtedly financing serious crime. So there's concerns about how that's actually working, whether that's somewhere that you want your organisation's money to be going. Then there's some more pragmatic issues to consider. So it might well be that paying that ransom will actually give you the decrypt key and you will be able to get access to the data that's been stolen. It might not mean that you'll be able to decrypt all your data. It might not mean you're able to decrypt it quickly. And actually, it might not mean you're able to decrypt any of it at all. So in choosing to pay, you are taking a risk. There is certainly no guarantee of a happy ending here. And then going back to what both Vic and Chris had said around these changes in ransomware that we're seeing, particularly over the last year or so, we've also had issues of organisations when they've actually exfiltrated the data, then demanding maybe a second ransom to avoid publishing that data on the dark web. So even if you pay a ransom and choose to pay a ransom to get your data back, you might not get your data, or you might get access to your data again, and it doesn't prevent the people who've done the attack actually publishing it elsewhere. We've also heard of a couple of very unfortunate occasions where a company has chosen to pay the ransom, but the vulnerability that was exploited in the first place hasn't actually been addressed, and the organisation has then just had exactly the same exactly the same attack replayed, which is obviously very painful for them. So I hope that gives you a sense of the range of considerations we would ask people to consider, and that's actually one of the questions covered in that blog I showed about what board members should be thinking about, because it's becoming such a hot topic.
Yeah, thank you. It's yeah, it is a long way off straightforward. So we've got a couple of questions that have come in. The first one is, how can a small company with limited resource keep up with the criminals without getting sold an external system monitoring plan that's way too extensive, and I would say probably way too expensive for a small organisation? I don't know, Victoria, is that one for you?
I can pick that up, Jonathan.
Okay,
It's a fantastic question, and I do a lot of work with micro businesses and small organisations who are in that same boat. They don't have the funds, they don't have the resources or the capacity to be installing huge network configurations and infrastructure. And we recognise that at the NCSC, because cybersecurity should be accessible to everybody, and there's beauty in doing the simple and free stuff well. Okay, I'm a big advocate that cybersecurity shouldn't be complicated. We can all do it. We should all be doing it. And just by implementing the very basic controls, which we all can do, we drastically improve our cybersecurity posture. To start with, we relaunched the Cyber Aware campaign at the end of last year, which takes small and micro organisations through the 6 key controls that we should all be implementing to build a baseline in our cybersecurity. Now, I won't go through all 6 of them, but 4 of the controls look at account management and account protection, and the importance of creating strong passwords and switching on 2-factor authentication. A lot of hackers are successful because they are leveraging weak passwords that the end user are using, whether this be password1, summer21. Okay, cyber criminals aren't as sophisticated as we like to think. So it's important that we as end users are implementing the best controls possible and having strong passwords to protect those accounts, which is why we recommend having a password of 3 random words, because a password for random words is much longer than a conventional password, and it takes that much longer to crack. So have a look at the Cyber Aware campaign. The Cyber Aware campaign has the self-assessment tool. Just spend 3 to 5 minutes answering a few questions about your organisation, and that will generate an action plan to help you implement those controls. If we then take that one step further, we have the small business guide, and I think this is really the crux of what the question was asking. The small business guide breaks down 5 controls that an organisation should be implementing into 5 actions that can be taken. So there's 25 actions that you can take, and if you implement each of those in turn, we drastically improve our cybersecurity posture. And the great thing is we haven't invested any additional funds or resources in technology. We may have had to purchase updates or make sure we're patching, but the Small Business Guide is there to act as a little to no cost guide for small organisations to implement the best cybersecurity. Jonathan, I think that's answered the question, but if there's more information, I can go into it.
Well, actually, interestingly, Chris, there's a follow-up question to that. So that's an interesting perspective, that these things don't necessarily always need to cost an arm and a leg. Some of the measures that you put in place don't always need to cost anything, but they just need to be done. They need to be understood and they need to be implemented. But there is a question here about effectively collective buying power. The community finance sector is largely fragmented. There are lots of small organisations don't have a great strength of buying power. Have you seen, in your role, Chris, with SMEs, have you seen trade bodies or other independent organisations get together in order to develop or to build that buying power, the economy of scale that can then be used across a sector? Is that something you've seen before, or clearly something that's interesting to this sector?
It's not a no, but I think it's hugely important for the finance sector to have that group buy-in. I mean, we do a lot of work with our trade and regulatory bodies to make these partnerships more aware of what's needed and to be able to implement better controls at a wider scale, as you say, Jonathan, that economy at scale. Because our work with our application bodies like yourselves is so vital to build that, to get that buy-in, to build that collective community. Because for me, a lot of this is that community spirit. It's about us working with another and our partner organisations to make sure that we are implementing these controls. I mean, most recently, the cyber resilience centres have come online in the regions, which are key organisations there to build that network and that community to better understand and improve the cybersecurity posture at a much more reasonable level. But beyond that, I think that that's a great place to start, and I couldn't comment any further about the economy of scale. Yeah,
and someone has responded to that question in the chat as well.
Yeah, that was me, just referencing that the school sector has done something quite similar over the last few years, and they club together in a particular way.
Oh, brilliant! Thank you.
Yeah.
A couple more questions. This one is, I think it's probably still for you, Chris. How should community finance providers best plan and prepare for emergency situations? What do you recommend regarding business continuity, disaster recovery, dress rehearsals, for example? It's a big question. It's a very
absolutely. And
I suppose, where do you start?
Absolutely. I think for any organisation, we need to be looking at our business continuity and disaster recovery plans. We now know that it's not a question of if, but when organisations suffer a cyber breach, and we know that those who are able to respond effectively are those which have strong business continuity plans in place and have then exercised those plans to make sure they're up to scratch. The recent cyber breach survey actually identified that only 31% of businesses have a business continuity plan which mentions cybersecurity, which means we are falling far short of what is required to respond. And in fact, a lot of the impact of a cyber breach isn't necessarily in the attack itself, but it's in the inability to respond effectively and be able to get our systems back up online. So we need to start looking at our business continuity plans and making sure that we address that cybersecurity risk. We at the NCSC, we have some great resources to help IT practitioners and the board look at our BCPs and disaster recovery plans. First and foremost, we have the response recovery plan, which is an add-on to the Small Business Guide, which takes an organisation through not only how to prepare for an incident and identify our key assets and the crown jewels, but also how to acknowledge and identify if we are or have been the victims of a cyber attack, and then how we resolve it. So the Response Recovery Guide is a fantastic product, a fantastic piece of guidance to help you build your business continuity plans if you don't have one, or building that cybersecurity element. Now, I appreciate that there may be many on the call who are looking for the next step, a little bit more sophisticated, which is why we have the 10 steps to cybersecurity, which looks at that risk management and how do we build incident management into our wider business planning and our business risk. And finally, Vic touched on this briefly at the beginning, but do check out the exercise in a box if you haven't already. There is a suite of tabletop exercises which are great to go through a cyber breach at peacetime. So how would you respond to ransomware, a DDoS attack? And the great thing about exercise in a box is it really brings in many parts of the organization. This isn't just for our CISOs, IT practitioners, this is for HR, for legal, for finance, for the board, to all come together to understand that common risk and that common agenda. So my recommendation to those on the call, if you haven't already, look at the exercise in a box, set some time aside for those people in your organization to come together, and that will really help you understand where you are with your business continuity planning and how to improve your plans, improve your disaster recovery plans. And again, fantastic resource for dress rehearsals.
Thank you very much, Chris, and that teed us up nicely for a good summary of some of the tools that you've got available to the sector to use, and again, stress-free to use. One final question, and then we're going to wrap up. Is hopefully a quick to answer. Our supplier has told us that a pen test is risky and might bring down our systems. Is that right?
I can answer that one. So obviously you need to take care. So the testers should make every effort to avoid causing like undue impact to the system being tested. But obviously, due to the nature of penetration testing, it is impossible to guarantee that no unexpected reactions to testing will occur. So this is all about that initial stage of talking to the company that you may be using and understand the scoping. And that initial engagement with that external team really needs to be talked through, like their skills and what you actually want to get out of the test. So if you don't want them to be too intrusive, that's the time when you can discuss it. And it's making sure that people, again, it depends on the type of test that you have as well. There's white box testing and black box testing. So if it's white box, then you give full information to the target about what your network and everything, so it makes it easy for them. We might do black box testing, so no information is shared, and therefore I suppose that one could be a little bit more intrusive because they don't really know much about your systems, and they'll try probably more intrusive like attack vectors and stuff as a way of trying to test your network. So yeah, it's just about having the conversation and taking care, really.
Thank you, Victoria, and that leads me now to close this webinar and this part of the toolkit. So thank you to everyone for joining us today, and I'm sure you found that really incredibly helpful to hear directly from the NCSC, and really want to give a really big thank you to Victoria, Chris and Hannah for your comprehensive presentations, not only today, but for the board session last week. So thank you very much. And I really encourage you to use all of these free resources that are available to you. Exercise in a box, top tips for staff, e-learning, the board toolkit itself. And Chris also mentioned a number of other resources which are going to help to set you up for really getting on top of your cybersecurity and your responsibilities. So also, there's the CISP, the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Partnership platform. Please do join that. And we're going to share these links in an email to you after this webinar. And if you have any follow-on questions that just come to you after the event, please do send them to us. The email is on the screen at the end of this presentation. So as we've been hearing, embedding cybersecurity in your organizations, it's essential. It's becoming more essential as you're becoming more digital as organizations. And I hope this webinar has really given you some food for thought and some tools to really set you on the path to bringing cybersecurity to the forefront of your and your board's thinking. Thanks again for attending. Thanks again to the NCSC team. It's been fantastic. Really appreciate it. Thank you.